Okay, today I want to show you how to set up a new point-to-point WireGuard connection with the Pro Custodibus connection wizard. So we'll start on the host page of Pro Custodibus and click the add icon, and let's say we'll create a new host called endpoint A, and we're going to create a new WireGuard configuration to push to this host. So as the first step, we'll choose the type of connection that we're going to create, and we just want a simple point-to-point connection. So click the next button, and now for the second step, we need to generate a new peer identity for endpoint A. So we'll generate a new public-private key pair, and on the other side of the connection, we'll also generate a new identity for the other host that we want to connect endpoint B. So we'll create a public key pair for it, and also generate a new host entry for endpoint B rather. So this will connect endpoint A to endpoint B. Now as this third step, we'll define the public transport that we'll use to connect public endpoint A and endpoint B. So to connect to endpoint A, we'll use a public IP address of 198.51.100.1, and we'll have a public UDP listen port of 51.8.21. And on the endpoint B side of the connection, we'll connect to it via public IP address 203.01.13.2 and have a public UDP listen port of 51.8.22. And so between those two IP addresses, we'll run a WireGuard tunnel here that we define using a private IP address space, and we'll define this private IP address space with a network block that will generate randomly here using a 24-bit block from the 10/8 larger block. And so we'll generate that and use a block of 10.92.113/24 and pull some private addresses within that space. And so for the endpoint A side, we use 10.92.113.1 for its private WireGuard address, and on the endpoint B side, we'll use 10.92.13.2 for its private WireGuard IP address. And so we'll route all traffic to 10.92.13.2 to endpoint B, and all traffic to 10.92.13.1 to endpoint A. So then for the final step of our wizard, we'll just review the WireGuard configuration changes that we'll make on the endpoint A side and on the endpoint B side. And that looks okay. So we'll click the apply button. And now to apply our changes, we can do one of two things. We can either set up a new Pro Custodibus agent on the host, or we can just download the interface configuration manually to apply it. So for endpoint A, I'll just download the configuration file manually, or I can snap the QR code or just copy and paste the configuration file. And on endpoint B, we can set up the Pro Custodibus agent so that the Pro Custodibus agent will apply our changes automatically. And so to do that, we just download the Pro Custodibus config file and the setup file, and we'd walk through these steps to set up the Pro Custodibus agent on endpoint B. And now if we wanted to apply, if we wanted to add say a third host to our point-to-point network, we could go through the same steps from the host page to add a new host. Say we'll call it endpoint C, and we'll create a new WireGuard configuration to push to this new host. We want it to be a point-to-point connection, and we'll create a new peer identity for endpoint C. On the other end of the connection, let's connect endpoint C to endpoint B using the existing peer identity that we just set up for endpoint B, and reusing that same public IP address that we just set up for endpoint B. And on the endpoint C side of the connection, it has a public IP address of 192.0.2.3 and a public UDP port of 51.823. So then for the fourth step of the wizard, we'll use the same internal WireGuard network address block that we just set up for endpoint A to connect to endpoint B, and use the same 110.92.13.2 address for endpoint B, and for endpoint C we'll give it a internal address of 10.92.13.3. And so for the final step of the wizard, we can review our changes. We'll continue to use the same interface that we set up for endpoint B in the previous step, but in the previous time that we just ran through this wizard, but we'll add a new definition to its WireGuard config file for endpoint C that we're just setting up, and then on endpoint C everything's new. We just are going to create this new interface on endpoint C. So we'll apply that, and on endpoint C we can go ahead and either download this new WireGuard configuration that we just generated, or set up the Pro Custodibus agent on endpoint C and have our changes applied automatically to it. So that's how you can use the Pro Custodibus interface wizard to set up a new connection for a new WireGuard point-to-point network.